The Great Plains had a way of reminding people that beauty and death could look identical. From a distance, a winter morning looked like peace, endless white, frozen stillness, not a sound but the wind politely screaming across the horizon. Up close though, it was a different story. The same wind could flay skin off your cheek in minutes and turn your breath into ice before it hit the air. The northern plains, the Rockies, the subarctic forests, they didn't host winter, they were winter. And the indigenous peoples who lived there didn't survive it because they were tougher. They survived because they were observant enough to notice that nature had rules, and breaking them usually meant being found in spring as a particularly educational cautionary tale. Blizzards didn't arrive, they ambushed. Temperatures dropped faster than a politician's promises. The horizon vanished. What had been a familiar landscape turned into an undifferentiated blur of white and silence, so total it seemed to hum. You couldn't navigate, you couldn't shout, you could only wait, perfectly still, while the cold negotiated with your body for control of your fingers. The Cheyenne, Lakota, Blackfoot, Cree, and dozens of others who called these lands home didn't just endure that kind of night. They learned to interpret it like a language. A shift in the wind wasn't weather, it was a warning. A certain dryness in the air meant the snow would bite harder. And once the flakes started falling in spirals rather than lines, everyone knew what came next: shelter, silence, and the long, disciplined art of not dying. Most modern people, if you dropped them into a plains blizzard, would last about as long as a candle in a hurricane. The idea of waiting it out in comfort would have made traditional hunters laugh. If laughter didn't waste so much breath, there was no central heating, no insulated boots, no endless Instagram captions about embracing the cozy. There was movement, instinct, and an intimacy with the environment, so precise it bordered on spiritual. Warmth wasn't something you owned, it was something you negotiated with the world around you. It came from understanding wind direction, soil type, and the peculiar art of not making dumb choices when the sky turned white. And yet, for all the terror of the cold, people still lived and thrived in it. Children were born, fires were kindled, songs were whispered into the howling dark. The landscape that could kill you was also the one that taught you patience, humility, and timing. Cold wasn't an enemy to be conquered. It was an elder to be respected. The first blizzard every winter was like the same old lesson repeated. Don't wander, don't panic, don't fight it. If you wanted to survive, you had to learn the trick. The trick, of course, wasn't one thing. It was dozens of tiny acts of genius that added up to survival. The way hides were layered, fires built, and silence kept. Generations of trial and error turned into instinct. People discovered that warmth was not just temperature, it was rhythm, breath, and presence. And from that realization came a kind of wisdom modern heating systems will never teach, that to stay alive in the cold, you must first become quiet enough to listen to it. Before anyone invented room temperature, warmth was a game of wits played against physics with whatever nature happened to leave lying around. There were no thermometers, no insulation charts, no fleece jackets with smug little logos. The measure of comfort was whether your fingers still bent in the morning. And yet, somehow, they managed to sleep through nights that could freeze spit mid-air, not by brute endurance, but by a kind of quiet engineering genius that modern camping brands would charge a fortune to rediscover. Everything started with understanding that heat wasn't made, it was kept. A fire could create it, sure, but keeping it was an art form. Hides weren't just clothing, they were layered systems of insulation. Bison, elk, rabbit, even grasses, each layer had a role. Grass stuffed into moccasins made a difference of several degrees, like an ancient version of thermal socks. A robe sewn from multiple hides trapped tiny pockets of air, which is precisely how modern insulation works, except without polyester and marketing departments. What they were doing, in essence, was manipulating microclimates, not in laboratories, but in tents of hide, bone, and logic. Fire, the usual hero of survival stories, wasn't the main act here. You couldn't just burn all night. Fuel was precious, and smoke killed faster than cold. In closed shelters, fires were carefully rationed. Coals were buried under ash to stay warm until morning. A single flame in a tipi was like a conversation, constant, respectful, never loud. It provided just enough heat to keep the frost from creeping down the poles, and that was all it needed to do. In a way, fire had manners. It knew its place. and the people who tended it had precision timing. Too much wood, and the shelter filled with choking smoke. Too little, and everyone froze. So they learned to read the fire's mood, the way smoke drifted, how embers glowed, and adjusted the shelter around it. Open the flap slightly to let wind pull smoke upward, then close it fast enough to trap the warmth. Every night was a tiny laboratory of airflow, humidity, and hope. Clothing followed the same logic. You didn't wear one heavy layer. You wore many light ones. Air, not fur, was the real insulator. That's why even modern Arctic survivalists still use the same principle. It's one of those moments where ancient common sense embarrasses modern technology. And none of this knowledge came from books. It came from watching animals. How a fox curls its tail over its nose. How snow collects in layers without melting. How even the wind carries warmth if you understand how to stand in it. But warmth wasn't only physical. It was cultural, emotional, collective. People sat close, not just to share heat, but to share presence, the most efficient energy exchange of all. Warmth traveled through skin and laughter, through stories told under hides, while the storm outside rearranged the continent. Because when the snow started falling sideways and the air bit like broken glass, the difference between life and death came down to one unscientific truth. Some people panicked, and others adjusted a flap, smiled at the fire, and went back to sleep. At night, survival became geometry. Not the classroom kind with rulers and smug triangles, but the kind that decided whether your heart kept beating until sunrise. The sleeping circle was one of humanity's oldest heat technologies, simple, elegant, and brutally effective. There were no individual beds. You became part of an equation of warmth, pressure, and trust. A family might lie in a tight oval, the smallest bodies at the center, adults forming the outer barrier like living walls. The pattern wasn't random. It followed airflow, body mass, and instinct. Children absorbed warmth, but lost it quickly. Elders radiated it more steadily. So the young were cocooned in the middle, breathing air already warmed by others. In larger camps, dogs curled at the edges, fur pressed against human legs, completing the circuit of shared heat. Modern science would call it thermal regulation. They called it sleeping. There was also meaning in the shape. Circles weren't just efficient, they were symbolic. Many plains and subarctic peoples believed life itself moved in circles. Seasons, the sun, the heartbeat. To sleep in that shape was to align with nature's rhythm, to place your body back into the same symmetry that governed storms and stars. There's something slightly poetic and slightly claustrophobic about realizing your comfort depends on 12 other people breathing at the same pace. Inside the circle, conversation was rare. Words cost warmth. The night belonged to listening, the size of the fire, the crack of frost outside, the small animal movements that told you the world was still alive. Silence wasn't emptiness. It was insulation. Breath became the quiet engine of survival, slow and synchronized, filling the air with human humidity that softened the cold. Every inhale was borrowed warmth. Every exhale, a gift returned to the group. Sleeping like that required trust most modern people don't possess. Imagine falling asleep nose to shoulder with the same relatives who, hours earlier, were arguing about dried meat rations. But out there, comfort had no privacy. If one person shifted too far from the circle, heat broke. One careless toss of an arm could leak warmth like an open door. It wasn't sentimental, it was physics wrapped in ritual. Even the arrangement of shelters reflected this thinking. The tipi, for example, was circular for a reason. The fire sat at the center, not for aesthetics but for balance, heat distributed evenly, smoke drawn upward through a single vent. The design was an architectural extension of the sleeping circle itself, concentric rings of survival, from the fire's heart to the cold edge of the world. And there's something darkly funny about it. The very thing most people now call personal space was, for thousands of years, the fastest way to die in winter. Isolation was luxury in summer and suicide in January. Warmth was never an individual achievement, it was a social contract sealed with shared breath. Because when the wind outside turned the plains into an ocean of moving white, the circle wasn't just where you slept, it was where the idea of humanity, soft, breakable, and stubbornly warm, kept itself alive. There's a kind of arrogance in modern architecture, the belief that if you throw enough insulation and plumbing at nature, it'll politely stay outside. The ancient shelters of the plains and subarctic peoples didn't have that luxury. They weren't built to dominate the weather. They were built to negotiate with it. Every pole, every seam, every flap of hide existed because someone, centuries earlier, had frozen half to death and thought, right, never again. The tipi was an aerodynamic miracle, portable, windproof, and astonishingly warm for what was essentially a cone made of sticks and animal skins. Its genius wasn't in materials, but in understanding airflow. The fire pit sat dead center, exactly where rising heat could spiral upward without suffocating the occupants. The smoke hole above acted like a lung, flaps adjusted by hand depending on the wind's direction. Two open, and the warmth fled. Two closed, and you coughed yourself into the afterlife. There was no thermostat, just instinct and observation. The same two tools that had kept people alive since the Ice Age. Underneath, the floor wasn't bare earth. Layers of reeds, cedar boughs, or even snow itself were packed to create insulation. Primitive, yes, but based on solid physics. Snow, oddly enough, traps air. It's one of the best insulators nature provides, assuming you don't melt it. So the same substance that buried travelers alive could also keep you from freezing if you treated it correctly. In colder forests farther north, people built semi-subterranean lodges, half buried in the earth, roofs covered with sod or bark. The ground temperature stayed relatively stable, a modest few degrees below freezing, which, compared to the surface wind, felt like luxury. Smoke from small fires escaped through carefully cut vents. Inside, the air was thick but survivable, a kind of breathable compromise between warmth and suffocation. And then there was smell. You can't discuss winter shelters without mentioning the perfume of survival, a mix of burning dung, wet hide, and smoke-stewed meat. Archaeologists will politely call it evidence of domestic activity. In truth, it was the scent of life refusing to quit. To modern noses it might seem unbearable, but to those huddled inside, that smell meant safety, the assurance that fire still burned, that hides still held, that the wind hadn't won yet. Even the smoke had its role. Wood smoke kills insects, cures hides, and adds an oily film that waterproofs everything it touches. Over time, it darkened the interiors of shelters until they looked like polished bronze. Those soot-lined walls weren't dirty, they were history. Every layer of smoke residue was a quiet record of storms survived. It's funny, in a dry way, how people now pay fortunes for smoky flavor and earth tones in designer lodges. The originals had that aesthetic perfected long before real estate agents invented the word rustic, and those who lived in them didn't need decorations. Their walls hummed with function. Every beam had a purpose. Every skin had a memory. And just beyond those thin walls, the cold waited, patient and amused, wondering how long this fragile species could keep the fire lit. When the snow began to fall sideways and the world turned into a moving wall of white, the smartest thing you could do was shut up. Silence, in those conditions, wasn't politeness, it was strategy. Noise carried strangely in a blizzard. Voices could vanish mid-sentence or bounce back from nowhere, disorienting travelers and alerting predators. So people learned early that stillness wasn't fear, it was discipline. You didn't shout into the storm because the storm didn't care. Inside the shelter, silence took on another purpose. It kept breath steady, slowed the heart, conserved warmth. Talking too much meant exhaling too much. Tiny clouds of heat rising into the rafters, wasted. Every word was a small leak in the ecosystem of survival. The elders knew this. They said the cold listened. Not metaphorically, they meant it. The air itself was alive with sensitivity. Disturb it, and it punished you with wind. Stay calm, and it left you alone. The rule was simple. After sunset, when the fire dropped to coals and the animals went still, speech belonged to necessity only. You whispered to feed the flames, to adjust the hide flap, to tell a restless child to hush. Everything else could wait for morning. It wasn't repression, it was reverence. The quiet held weight. It reminded everyone that outside those walls, nature was always awake, and you were the guest. Sometimes, though, silence was broken by stories. But even stories followed the rhythm of the cold, slow, deliberate, told by low firelight that made faces flicker between human and ghost. Voices didn't rise, they glided. Laughter, when it happened, was soft and brief, almost embarrassed. Even joy learned to whisper in winter. This habit of silence puzzled early European observers. They thought it was stoicism or superstition. In reality, it was physics. Sound is energy. Energy is heat. And in a night where temperature dropped a degree every hour, even the air in your lungs was a resource to be budgeted. Every breath spent talking was a degree lost. The silence also did something unexpected. It created awareness. In the absence of chatter, the senses sharpened. You could hear the difference between a shifting log and a distant coyote. You could tell the temperature by the texture of the snow under your hide. You could feel the vibration of the wind against the shelter's skin. It wasn't mystical, it was observation refined by survival, and there was humor in it too. Because every group, no matter how disciplined, had one person who couldn't help breaking the rule. The chronic whisperer, the midnight philosopher. They'd start a story, and halfway through, someone would throw a piece of dried hide in their direction and mutter, "Save your breath, storyteller." By morning, no one mentioned it. They didn't have to. The cold had a way of teaching lessons better than elders ever could. Silence, in that sense, was more than the absence of sound. It was a contract between people and the elements, between warmth and restraint. It was how a camp the size of a modern living room could hold a dozen bodies, a dozen heartbeats, and not a single wasted word. And when the storm finally passed, when the first thread of light hit the smoke hole, someone would break that silence with one word, maybe a joke about how nobody froze, and laughter would fill the air again, like breath returning to the world. In the old winters, fire wasn't a tool. It was a relative, unpredictable, temperamental, but loved anyway. You didn't make fire. You coaxed it into existence. It had to be fed gently, watched constantly, and spoken to as if it could understand you. And maybe it could, because those who didn't treat it with respect tended not to survive long enough to argue the point. The relationship was intimate. Fire sat at the center of every life, a heartbeat glowing in the dark. You could measure the health of a camp by how its flames moved. If they burned steady and low, everything was in balance. If they sputtered or screamed, something was wrong. Bad wood, bad weather, or bad spirits. Either way, fire had opinions, and ignoring them was like ignoring a barking dog outside your tent. People fed it carefully, dry twigs, twisted grasses, animal dung when nothing else was available. The Lakota would bury hot coals under ash at night to keep them alive until morning, a trick both elegant and necessary. No one wanted to start from scratch in 30 degrees Celsius wind. Rubbing sticks together in that weather was a performance art piece called hypothermia. So instead, they'd smother the coals like sleeping children, covering them until dawn, when a single breath would wake the flame again. Different woods meant different moods. Cottonwood burned with a soft hiss, birch with a quick crackle, sagebrush with smoke that doubled as insect repellent and spiritual cleanser. The smoke itself was part of the ritual cleansing, comforting, slightly accusatory. Too much and your eyes watered, too little and you froze. Every campfire was a balancing act between warmth and suffocation, and those who mastered it could hold a kind of power that no rank or title could give. And there were rules unspoken but absolute. You never walked between a person and their fire. You never mocked its size. You never threw waste into it carelessly, because that was like feeding your guest garbage. Fire was alive, and alive things had pride. Some tribes even had firekeepers, people whose sole job was to tend the flame, to make sure it didn't go out, to keep the camp's spirit literally burning. It sounds poetic until you realize how exhausting it was. Imagine being on night shift for eternity, with death as your supervisor. The fire also carried messages. Smoke rising straight up meant good omens and stable air. Smoke curling sideways meant wind, change, or visitors. Hunters read it the way modern people read weather apps, except this one didn't require Wi-Fi, just intuition. Even the color of the flame told a story. Blue for dry wood, orange for resin, red for warmth, deep enough to last the night. But the most beautiful part was the quiet respect that surrounded it. You could tell when someone new to the cold came along. They treated fire like a heater, sat too close, burned too bright, wasted its life in minutes. The experienced ones sat back, patient, knowing that the flame's power came from restraint. It's hard not to admire that kind of intelligence, the ability to build warmth not through consumption, but through relationship. The fire didn't serve them, it accompanied them, a living reminder that even the smallest light, treated kindly, can outlast the storm. Warmth had fur. That was the first rule of winter on the plains. Before humans invented synthetic fibers and called it progress, they had wolves, dogs, and horses, the original heating systems, powered by loyalty and body heat. During the worst blizzards, survival meant collapsing every category that separated species. Humans, animals, fire, all exhaled into the same cloud of breath. It wasn't sentimentality. It was thermodynamics with a pulse. Dogs were the most dependable partners, thick-coated, small enough to curl close, large enough to matter. At night, they'd slip inside the tipi or lodge without ceremony, circle 3 times like small storms, then settle against legs and feet. Nobody complained. A dog's warmth could mean the difference between waking up or being found by thaw in the spring. Children were often placed between them, a fur-lined insurance policy. And yes, it smelled. Everything did. But comfort isn't about aroma. It's about surviving till dawn. The arrangement wasn't just practical. It was practiced. Some Arctic and Plains groups even designed bedding to accommodate the dog's hides, spread with a low outer ring where the animals slept, sealing in warmth, like living insulation. In that space, the boundary between species blurred. You could say domestic partnership had a much older meaning. Horses, newer to the continent's indigenous life, served differently. They radiated heat like small suns, their bodies steaming against the frozen air. During long journeys, a rider could press a cheek to the horse's neck and feel warmth seep through skin and bone, a reminder that life persisted under the frost. Travelers sometimes slept, standing between their horses, letting the animal's bulk block the wind. It wasn't comfortable, nothing in that season was, but it kept the blood moving, and that was luxury enough. The observation went both ways. People learned from the animals how to survive, how wolves huddled nose to tail, how bison turned their backs to the storm, how snow could act as shelter rather than danger. They saw that even creatures of the wild didn't fight the cold. They folded into it, adjusted, shared. That philosophy carried into human shelter. When temperatures dropped so low that even the fire sulked, some families wrapped small pups, or even infants in the same fur bundles, letting their combined heat pulse together until dawn. It wasn't affection, it was physics applied with tenderness. It's almost funny to think about how the modern world still measures wealth in isolation. Square meters, private rooms, temperature control per person, while those who survived the coldest nights knew the opposite truth. The more bodies, the more safety. A crowded tipi in winter was heaven compared to a solitary hut in silence. Warmth grew exponentially when shared. In that interspecies communion, there was no illusion of dominance. Humans weren't masters of animals, they were co-conspirators in survival. Each breath in the circle was borrowed, each heartbeat part of the same fragile system against a landscape that couldn't care less who was the apex predator. And when dawn finally came, the kind of dawn that didn't look brighter, just less black, the dogs would stretch, shake off the frost, and walk out first, noses to the wind. If they refused to leave, no one else did either, because in those winters, instinct wasn't primitive. It was the highest form of intelligence. Survival, when you strip away the romance, is mostly digestion. The human body in winter is a small, inefficient furnace that requires constant fuel, and on the plains or tundra, fuel didn't come with a nutrition label, it came with a heartbeat. Calories were sacred, fat was currency, and the people who lived through 40 nights understood something modern diet culture never will. You cannot outthink the cold on an empty stomach. The winter diet wasn't elaborate, but it was genius. Dried meat, fat, and berries were pounded into pemmican, a dense, brick-like miracle that could last for years without spoiling. One handful could power you through half a day of hunting in blinding snow. Think of it as the original protein bar, minus the branding and existential guilt. It didn't taste good, but it didn't need to. It was pure energy in edible form, a technology older than metallurgy, and just as crucial. Then there was bone marrow, the high-octane fuel of survival. Cracked open and roasted, it gave both warmth and strength. Broths simmered for hours in hide containers, heated with stones pulled straight from the fire. You didn't drink it for comfort. You drank it because the body has its own fire, and if you didn't feed it, it went out. The idea that warmth comes from the inside wasn't a metaphor. It was a biochemical fact known long before anyone discovered mitochondria. Meals followed a rhythm that matched the body's metabolism, not the clock. Small, frequent bites rather than feasts, enough to keep the inner furnace steady. A full stomach was risky. Digestion pulls blood to the core, leaving fingers numb. So people learned moderation, not for virtue but for circulation. You didn't eat to feel full. You ate to stay alive. Every ingredient had a role. Fat, insulated from within. Protein repaired, muscle worn down by cold. Berries preserved during autumn added vitamins that kept scurvy at bay. Even snow had its purpose, melted for hydration, carefully rationed to avoid lowering core temperature. Nothing was wasted, not even ashes. Some mixed them into food to replace lost minerals. It sounds grim, but survival rarely looks glamorous. And warmth wasn't just metabolic, it was communal. Cooking fires drew everyone together. Food wasn't served in courses, but in handfuls, passed from palm to palm. Hot stones keeping it warm longer. Children learned to eat slowly, to savor the heat rising from the bowl as much as the flavor itself. It was a lesson in economy, the kind that modern civilization buried under central heating and convenience stores. The humor of it all lies in perspective. Today, people pay for cold-pressed juices and fat-free diets while their ancestors celebrated every greasy drop. Back then, a glistening film of fat on the lips wasn't shameful. It was survival's signature. The difference between indulgence and necessity was only temperature. And when the fire dimmed and bellies were full enough for the night, that inner warmth did something extraordinary. It synchronized with the collective one. Dozens of small bodies digesting together, radiating shared heat, a silent symphony of metabolism under the howl of the blizzard. Out there, warmth wasn't luxury. It was chemistry made holy, the art of turning hunger into heat, and heat into one more morning alive. Clothing, for most of human history, wasn't fashion. It was architecture for the body, portable housing for people who couldn't afford to freeze. On the plains and in the northern forests, winter dressing was an act of design genius, built entirely out of dead things. Every stitch, every hide, every fringe was a lesson written in blood, smoke, and cold. The goal wasn't to look good. The goal was to remain alive and vaguely flexible by morning. The trick wasn't bulk, it was layering. The people who lived where the wind could flay the skin off your knuckles learned that air itself was the best insulator. Layers of hide and fur trapped tiny pockets of air, creating invisible blankets between materials. Bison robes, rabbit-skin cloaks, even woven grasses served this purpose. The effect was the same principle behind modern down jackets, only without the marketing department. They didn't bundle up, they engineered microclimates. Footwear was another masterpiece. Moccasins weren't just shoes, they were weather negotiations, soft, supple, and layered with dry grasses for insulation. They allowed circulation, because tight boots kill faster than frostbite ever could. When snow built up, leggings were tight over them, layered with fur strips, turning the leg into something halfway between a tree trunk and a miracle of thermoregulation. You could walk for hours without your feet becoming brittle ice sculptures. And the materials themselves were carefully chosen. Caribou hide, for instance, insulates better than almost any modern fabric, each hair hollow, trapping heat the way double-paned windows do. Deer hide was lighter and more flexible for inner layers. The difference between surviving 40 and becoming a historical curiosity often came down to whether someone had chosen the right animal. Even the sewing was strategy. Hides were stitched with sinew, not thread, which swelled when damp, sealing out wind and moisture better than any waterproof membrane. Stitching wasn't decoration. It was engineering disguised as embroidery. When archaeologists later examined centuries-old garments, they found the seams still tight, the design nearly perfect. Survival, apparently, was also good tailoring. Headwear mattered too, and forget the myth of bareheaded stoics in the snow. Fur hoods and caps were essential, lined with down or moss, tied under the chin to trap the breath that otherwise escaped uselessly into the air. Some designs even incorporated the fur turned inward, so the heat from exhalation warmed the face. A feature modern parka designers like to pretend they invented. There was even thought given to movement. Clothing had to breathe. Sweat was a silent killer. One misjudged sprint through snow, and the moisture trapped under too many layers could freeze solid, turning your shirt into an elegant shroud. So garments were adjustable, loosened when working, tightened at rest. A wearable thermostat, powered by awareness. And then there were the little details that reveal a kind of practical humor. Snow goggles carved from bone or wood to prevent blindness. Mittens large enough to let fingers share warmth, one of the few times communal living extended to the hand. Everything was intentional, nothing ornamental. Even beauty served purpose. Beads might hold a stitch in place. Fringe could wick away melting snow. The result wasn't primitive fashion. It was applied physics, perfected by people who measured success in heartbeats, not aesthetics. Their wardrobes didn't follow trends, they followed thermodynamics. And beneath all that fur, hide, and sinew, there was always the same heartbeat, steady, warm, defiant, proving, once again, that intelligence isn't about invention. It's about observation, and the will to keep breathing while the world tries to turn you into ice. Out in the cold, instinct wasn't a mystical gift, it was data collection with better posture. Long before meteorologists stood in front of green screens, the indigenous peoples of the plains, forests, and tundra read the sky like a book that never lied. They knew when a blizzard was coming, not because a barometer said so, but because the air went to still, or because snow began to whisper instead of fall. What we call intuition was just observation practiced, until it looked like magic. Everything, absolutely everything, was a signal. The way smoke rose from a fire told you about the wind miles away. The behavior of birds predicted changes in pressure. When they flew low, weather was turning. Even the way snow sounded underfoot gave information. Dry snow squeaked, safe travel. Wet snow hissed, storm coming. To someone trained by the cold, the world was an orchestra of warnings. To everyone else, it was white noise until it killed you. People didn't just notice these things, they remembered them across generations. Stories carried meteorology disguised as myth. A grandmother might say, when the stars pulsed like eyes, "Don't travel." And it sounded poetic, until you realized it referred to visible refraction caused by ice crystals in the upper atmosphere. Science, dressed as story. It worked better than a weather app, because no one forgot it. The same sharpness of attention extended to the body. The body was a living barometer. Heart rate, skin tone, and even the way fingertips moved gave early signs of danger. Numbness was never ignored. Shivering wasn't a nuisance, but a diagnostic. Stop shivering, and you were in trouble. They didn't call it hypothermia. They called it the body going quiet, and the cure was movement, not frantic, but rhythmic. Keep the blood flowing, keep the spirit awake. This relationship with the environment blurred the line between instinct and intellect. Knowledge wasn't written down. It was performed in how one built a fire, adjusted clothing, or chose the right side of a hill for shelter. It was learned by watching, by listening, by failing and remembering. And failure in winter had excellent memory. There was no arrogance in this knowledge. People never pretended they controlled nature. They aligned with it. A storm wasn't an obstacle, it was a schedule change. If animals went silent, humans followed suit. If the air thickened with frost, work stopped. The land spoke in temperatures, and the wise ones answered by adjusting, not complaining. Even the act of walking showed it. Travelers knew to move with the wind, not against it. They used the rhythm of snowflakes to guide their breathing. Some could navigate in whiteouts by sensing how air pressed differently on the skin from each direction, a skill that, to a scientist, might sound like nonsense, but to those who practiced it, was as real as sight. The humor here lies in contrast. Modern civilization needs satellites to predict rain. These people could forecast a storm by watching dogs turn their backs to the horizon. They weren't primitive, they were observant enough to survive without gadgets, because out there, survival was never about muscle or firepower. It was about noticing the invisible, the thin margins between warmth and cold, safety and blindness, arrogance and extinction. Instinct was simply memory stored in the body, repeated until it became second nature. And that, in the end, was the greatest wisdom of all. The understanding that nature never tried to kill anyone, it simply waited to see who was paying attention. Childhood, in the northern plains, was not the soft pillar-fort experiment in self-expression we like to imagine now. There were no tantrums about wearing coats. If a child refused to bundle up, the wind handled the parenting. The first lesson came fast. Comfort was optional. Awareness was mandatory. From the moment they could walk, children were trained not to fear the cold, but to read it, to sense its moods, to recognize its teeth. It wasn't cruelty, it was continuity. Infants were carried in cradleboards lined with fur, snug enough that their breath fogged the edges. The air they exhaled was collected by the insulation, subtly warming them further. Mothers tested whether a baby was warm enough by pressing their lips to its forehead, not a gesture of affection, but calibration. If the skin felt cool, another layer was added. If it was hot, one was removed. A whole generation learned early that temperature was not a number, but a dialogue between skin and world. As soon as children could toddle, they were allowed short encounters with the cold, supervised, but unsheltered. They learned to touch snow, to breathe its sharpness, to feel how quickly fingers stiffened. The goal wasn't punishment, it was education through sensation. To understand cold, not as an enemy, but as something that would always be there, like wind or hunger, or the occasional disappointing relative. And because fear wastes energy, they taught children not to indulge it. They played outside in temperatures that would make modern playgrounds file lawsuits. Their games sliding on frozen hides, racing to fetch snow for water, doubled as resilience drills. No one said, build character, they just did it. Small bodies learned circulation before arithmetic. If you stop moving, you'll get cold, was as basic as if you stop breathing, you'll die. It sounds brutal, but it worked. Those children grew into adults who could sleep through a storm and wake up with all their fingers. The training was subtle, constant. Kids were told to listen for how snow changes sound, a deep muffling that means more is coming. They learned to tell which wood burns best by how it smells when cut. They practiced patience, sitting still near the fire until they could feel the difference between warmth on the skin and heat in the bones. And above all, they were warned, never trust comfort. The moment you feel too warm, danger is close. Sweat in cold air is a silent assassin. It's almost comic, thinking of how modern parents panic over children catching a chill. Back then, the chill was the classroom, and the teachers were relentless. Forget gold stars. Success meant survival. Failure meant the kind of lesson everyone remembered in spring. Yet, beneath the pragmatism, there was tenderness. Elders watched closely, always ready with a fur wrap or a gentle scolding. They didn't shelter children from hardship. They escorted them through it. Warmth was a collective responsibility, but self-reliance was part of the curriculum. Each generation was an apprenticeship in endurance. By adolescence, cold wasn't discomfort, it was context. A person's worth wasn't measured by how well they avoided it, but how calmly they met it. Those who panicked in snowstorms were pitied, not blamed. They hadn't been taught to listen soon enough. And perhaps that's what made those cultures last. They treated resilience not as heroism, but as habit. Children didn't grow up to fear the cold because they had learned, early on, that it had rules. And once you understand the rules of something that can kill you, you start to see the world not as cruel, but as cooperative, provided you have the sense to keep moving. Out on the open plains, the line between weather and divinity was thin enough to freeze solid. A blizzard wasn't just a meteorological event, it was a visitation. The wind had character, the snow had a voice, and the silence between them was a sermon. It's easy to imagine superstition there, but that's just what people who've never faced a white horizon think. For those who had, the storm wasn't supernatural, it was spiritual, which is much harder to argue with. When the cold came in walls of moving air, people didn't curse it, they listened. You can't fight a blizzard, so the only winning strategy is humility. Many plains and subarctic peoples, the Cree, the Lakota, the Dene, the Ojibwe, treated extreme weather as a teacher rather than punishment. The first thing it taught was patience. You learned quickly that survival favored the still, not the frantic. Panic burned calories and air. Stillness preserved both. So when storms rolled over camp, people went quiet, as though the land itself had ordered it. Firelight dimmed, movement slowed, and breath became deliberate, a kind of meditation born of necessity. In that silence, they believed the spirits of the land passed close, wrapped in the snow. Fear was considered dangerous, not just physically but cosmically. Fear disrupted balance. And in a world where balance was the difference between full bellies and famine, between safe passage and wandering forever, balance was everything. There were songs for storms, but they weren't sung at the storm. They were sung with its low, rhythmic tones that matched the wind's vibration. Some called it prayer, others called it harmony. Either way, it was cooperation disguised as reverence. A storm, after all, had no interest in human affairs, but it respected composure. To lose your composure was to lose your place in the order of things, and it wasn't all solemnity. People found humor in it too. Dark, dry humor, the kind that only surfaces when death has good timing. Someone might murmur, "The spirits are arguing again," as wind ripped through the camp. Another would nod, pull their robe tighter, and say, "Let them finish." This wasn't defiance, it was dignity. A reminder that survival wasn't just about strength, it was about grace under absurd conditions. The spirituality of the cold had rules. Don't speak in anger during a storm. Don't mock the wind. Don't whistle at night. The air carries messages you don't want returning. These weren't quaint superstitions. They were behavioral codes that kept people calm and cohesive when nature turned violent. Belief became emotional regulation long before psychology discovered breathing exercises. The storm was also a rehearsal for death, not in a morbid way, but in the sense that it forced stillness, surrender, and attention to what truly mattered. Breath, warmth, the faint crackle of fire, the pulse of life inside fragility. Those who endured it came out altered, you could tell, in the way they moved, slower, quieter, as if they'd learned something sacred in that white blindness. Even today, when the wind rises in northern forests and the snow starts to spin sideways, there's a peculiar sense that it's not just weather happening, it's something older, testing whoever's still listening. Because in those storms, survival required something rarer than courage. It required respect, and the kind of silence that only wisdom can afford. Warmth, for the people who lived where the earth froze solid half the year, wasn't an individual experience. It was a social one. You didn't keep yourself warm, you kept each other warm. Every ember of heat, every scrap of food, every animal hide was shared because survival didn't care about ownership. It cared about cooperation. The cold was democracy in its purest form. If one person froze, everyone paid for it. A winter camp was an organism, and every person in it was a vital organ. The elders positioned themselves closest to the fire, not out of privilege but efficiency. They needed the warmth most, and their presence helped keep the younger ones alert. Children slept at the core, wrapped in layers of fur and surrounded by adults. Hunters and warriors took the outer ring, forming a living barrier between the cold and the vulnerable. Even dogs had assigned spots, not random, but strategic. Each body part of the camp's ecosystem, each breath contributing to the balance. Meals followed the same logic. There were no personal plates, no my portion. Food moved in circles, hands passing bowls, spoons dipping communally, everyone aware that hoarding was heresy. To eat alone was shameful, almost superstitious. The idea that warmth or food could belong to one person contradicted everything the cold taught. If fire and shelter were collective achievements, then hunger had to be shared too. And when someone was struggling, sick, injured, or just exhausted from hunting through waist-deep snow, help arrived automatically. No ceremony, no praise. Someone adjusted the hides, another fed the fire, another handed over their share of broth. No one waited for permission, because there wasn't time for morality debates when frostbite had a head start. Altruism wasn't a virtue, it was strategy. This sense of responsibility extended to firewood, tools, and labor. If you gathered more than you needed, it wasn't called generosity, it was foresight. Because a camp's strength was measured not in resources, but in readiness. A single careless mistake, one unattended flame or forgotten coal, could undo the entire system. Everyone depended on everyone else being competent. It was social pressure as survival mechanism, which, if we're being honest, might still be the most effective governance model ever invented. Of course, tensions existed. There were always disputes over fire placement, over who snored too loud, over whether someone's cousin really did accidentally burn half the drying rack. But even anger was managed carefully. The elders reminded everyone that heat leaves fastest when people argue. Literally, shouting wastes air, sharpens breath, and lets in cold. So if you were furious, you waited until morning to express it. Emotional regulation wasn't self-help, it was climate control. The underlying philosophy was simple. Warmth was a social fabric woven one act at a time. You could build the most perfect shelter in the world, but if your neighbor's fire died, you'd still feel the cold eventually. So, people took care of one another preemptively. The way you check a fire before it dies, quietly, without announcement. It's ironic, really, how modern society praises independence like it's an evolutionary achievement. The people who survived real winters knew better. Independence freezes fast. Interdependence keeps breathing. In that endless white silence, community wasn't idealism. It was physics with heartbeats. If summer was the season of abundance, winter was the season of humility. The great equalizer that turned even the proudest hunter into a meticulous planner. On the Great Plains, across the boreal forests and the icy edges of what's now Canada and the northern US, people didn't fight the seasons. They moved with them. Migration wasn't aimless wandering. It was choreography with the earth. Those who mistimed their steps froze. Those who listened to the wind, the animals, the tilt of the light, made it through. Before the first snow ever fell, camps shifted to wintering grounds. These weren't chosen at random. They were tucked behind tree lines, in valleys sheltered from the prevailing winds, or near rivers that froze late and thawed early. Natural windbreaks, animal migration routes, and wood supplies were all calculated without calculation. Knowledge passed through memory, not maps. People who lived semi-nomadically carried the entire blueprint of their environment in their heads, and the cold rewarded the ones who remembered details. The rhythm of the year was less a calendar than a pulse. Summer was movement, hunting, gathering, trade, preparation. Winter was contraction, quiet, ritual, repair. The camps shrank. The noise faded. Fires burned, smaller, slower. It wasn't stagnation. It was strategy. When food grew scarce and daylight stingy, stillness conserved energy the way an animal hibernates. To outsiders, it might have looked like hardship. To those inside it, it was balance. Migration itself was a masterpiece of timing. People followed the herds, but always with awareness of snowdrift patterns and frozen rivers that could trap the unobservant. Trails weren't fixed, they evolved each year, shaped by memory, weather, and luck. Even the dogs knew the way, noses buried in the wind like compasses that breathed. And when storms came mid-journey, everyone knew what to do. Stop, dig in, disappear beneath the snow. You don't fight the landscape. You let it forget you exist until it calms down. There's a sort of dry humor in how practical all of it was. Modern survival shows love to dramatize endurance as chaos. People shouting at the sky, eating bark, crying into the void. Real survival, the ancestral kind, was boring, predictable. No theatrics, no ego. Just people doing the same sensible things their ancestors had done 1,000 times before, because that's what worked. They didn't improvise, they remembered. The environment wasn't just endured, it was orchestrated. Winter had its rituals, the setting of traps before sunset, the checking of frozen fish holes, the wrapping of tools in hides so the metal wouldn't stick to skin. The sounds of daily life shifted, less shouting, more scraping, the hum of stone against bone. The cold made music out of restraint, and yet, for all its severity, winter wasn't just punishment, it was a kind of purification. It stripped away noise, both literal and social. Quarrels went quiet. Festivals grew smaller, more intimate. There was time to repair tools, retell stories, and remember why patience mattered. The cold turned everyone into philosophers, not the loud, dramatic kind, but the kind who understood that stillness itself was a form of thought. In that rhythm of migration and rest, of motion and pause, life became a cycle of return, not escape. No one tried to outrun winter. They just learned to meet it halfway, at the right time, in the right place, with the right people. And perhaps that was the true genius of adaptation, realizing that survival wasn't about resisting the world, but learning its choreography and moving in time. Most people today treat the cold as an inconvenience, something to be conquered with central heating, overpriced jackets, and a deep personal relationship with thermostats. But the old winter cultures knew better. They understood that warmth wasn't a machine's job. It was a relationship, a delicate alliance between people, animals, air, and patience. Their wisdom didn't vanish when the snow melted. It just changed form, like smoke after a fire. That knowledge was layered, practical, and deeply poetic, without ever trying to be. It taught that survival depends less on strength than on sensitivity. You don't need to dominate your environment. You need to notice it. The way the frost creeps along the wood, the way the dogs turn their noses east before a storm, the way silence thickens before dawn. These were their textbooks. They weren't studying nature, they were listening to it, and the lessons remain eerily relevant. Modern science, after several centuries of catching up, now confirms what those winter camps already knew, that shared heat is more efficient than individual effort, that calm breathing slows cooling, that snow insulates better than metal, that moving together distributes warmth. What we call thermodynamics was once just common sense. The old hunters, the grandmothers, the firekeepers, they were physicists who never wrote anything down because they didn't need to. Their experiments were repeatable every night. Even the moral lessons hold up. Hoard warmth, and the group weakens. Share it, and everyone survives. Speak too much, and you lose heat. Stay still too long, and you lose blood. Everything balanced. The storm didn't allow ego. It shaved off the unnecessary, leaving behind only cooperation, humility, and dry humor, the three things that never froze. The irony, of course, is that civilization spent millennia trying to outgrow this wisdom and is now paying fortunes to relearn it. Breathwork, mindfulness, cold therapy, all just new names for ancient composure. We've built houses that shut us off from weather, then wonder why we feel disconnected from the world. Meanwhile, the people who once slept in circles under bison hides already understood what modern philosophers keep writing books about, that comfort means nothing without awareness. Their way of seeing the cold wasn't nostalgic or heroic. It was pragmatic spirituality, reverence born from realism. They didn't worship the storm, they respected it. They didn't fear the silence, they trusted it. And perhaps that's what made their survival not only possible but graceful. Because grace, in a blizzard, is knowing how to move without complaint. The old camps are gone now. The fires reduced to ash and archaeology. But if you stand somewhere open and wind-scoured, the Dakotas, the northern plains, the tundra at dusk, you can still feel their logic in the air. The hush, the patience, the invisible cooperation of elements that makes warmth possible. The secret trick wasn't hidden technology or superhuman toughness. It was awareness practiced until it became peace. And maybe that's the cold's final lesson. Warmth is not a condition. It's a behavior learned, shared, and remembered by those who knew that silence, instinct, and one well-tended flame were enough to outlast the night. Long before anyone could spell infection, humans were already experimenting with not dying from it. The first healers didn't wear white coats. They were the ones who stared at a festering wound long enough to notice which methods worked and which ones turned their patients into cautionary tales. The earliest evidence of medical care is older than writing itself. Skulls with neat holes carved into them and signs of bone regrowth. Trepanation, they call it now, the art of letting spirits, pressure, or maybe just bad luck, escape through the skull. A terrifying thought, but remarkably effective if you survived the first few minutes. The world then was sharp, dirty, and constantly trying to kill you. Hunters came home with gashes the size of a hand. Women tore during childbirth. Children learned early that rocks and gravity were not allies. And yet, somehow, humanity didn't bleed itself into extinction. Archaeologists have found skeletons showing signs of broken bones healed straight, infections contained, amputations survived. Someone somewhere was figuring things out with nothing but stone, ash, and audacity. Dirt, ironically, wasn't always the enemy. It carried clay, and clay carried minerals that drew out infection. Pressing earth onto wounds might look primitive now, but it worked often enough to earn a permanent spot in prehistory's first aid kit. In some cases, they even used spider webs, not out of creativity, but because they noticed something strange. Wounds wrapped in webs didn't rot as quickly. Modern science later confirmed what instinct had already guessed. Spider silk contains antiseptic peptides and helps clot blood. So yes, the first bandages came with legs. And they didn't just react, they observed. Someone noticed that wounds closed faster when they were kept moist, not left open to the air. Others realized that certain smells, resin, pine, crushed leaves, meant less swelling and fewer funerals. Through brutal trial and error, they learned the first rule of wound care: nature kills you. But it also leaves clues on how not to die. There's a strange elegance to it all. Imagine a world where surgery meant flint knives and sunlight, where the only anesthesia was fainting, and yet people still survived. They may not have understood bacteria, but they understood patterns. A good healer wasn't mystical. They were observant. The tribe's life expectancy often depended on someone who noticed that wounds cleaned in running water healed better than those washed in stagnant ponds. That's not magic. That's data collection, 30,000 years early. And somewhere, in a cave, under flickering light, someone must have realized the deeper truth. The body wants to heal itself. The healer's job wasn't to interfere, it was to give it the right conditions to do so. So they set bones, drained abscesses, and kept wounds clean in the only sterile environment available: the open air and a steady hand. It's humbling, really. The first doctors didn't need theories about microbes. They had survival rates, and every scar that healed became a record of trial and success, a prehistoric clinical report written in flesh. Because once a species learns to stop bleeding to death, it starts asking harder questions, like how to stop the pain, or the swelling, or the fever that follows. And that's when the forests, fields, and roots began whispering their own cures. Nature, it turns out, was running a pharmacy long before anyone thought to invent paperwork. Every forest, desert, and swamp had its own dispensary: leaves for burns, bark for fever, sap for infection, and early healers were the only customers with lifetime membership. The difference between a healer and a corpse, most of the time, was botanical literacy. They didn't have microscopes, but they knew that certain plants made wounds close faster, others made the pain fade, and a few made people see colors that weren't there. Sometimes all three at once. Yarrow was one of the classics. Its Latin name, Achillea millefolium, nods to the myth that Achilles packed his soldiers' wounds with it. Whether or not that's true doesn't matter. The plant works. It stops bleeding, fights bacteria, and tastes like something a god of war might chew on. Across continents, from the Celtic highlands to the plains of North America, people found it growing near battlefields and never took the hint to leave it alone. There's something almost poetic about the fact that the earth seems to grow clotting agents near where humans most often spill blood. Then, there was plantain-knot, the banana, but the small, stubborn weed that grows anywhere shoes have ever stepped. Its crushed leaves soothe bites, burns, and cuts. Ancient healers didn't need chemical analysis to know it worked. They had skin in the game, literally. The same goes for willow bark, nature's prototype for aspirin. People learned that chewing it dulled pain and reduced swelling. Fast forward a few millennia, and laboratories confirmed that, yes, willow bark contains salicin, which turns into salicylic acid, the same ingredient modern medicine rediscovered and patented. Progress is mostly archaeology with better branding. Resins and saps made appearances too. Pine pitch, rich in antiseptic oils, was smeared onto wounds to seal them from the elements. It wasn't elegant, but it kept infections at bay. Neosporin, version 0. Honey joined the list early as well. Thick, golden, and impossible for bacteria to colonize, it became both food and medicine. A healer with honey, resin, and clean water had the Bronze Age equivalent of a trauma kit. But this wasn't random luck. These discoveries came from endless trial and unflinching observation. Someone noticed that wounds cleaned with a certain leaf smelled better afterward, not pleasant, exactly, but less like decay. Others saw animals rolling in specific herbs after injury and thought, worth a try. Observation became experiment. Experiment became ritual. Over time, rituals built entire systems of medicine. Amazonian shamans with hundreds of plant recipes, African herbalists with encyclopedias in their heads, Arctic healers using moss as surgical pads. Even the rituals surrounding these cures had function. Songs, chants, smoke, they weren't superstitions. They were sanitation. Burning herbs released antiseptic compounds, waving smoke over wounds, sterilized air long before germ theory justified the drama. It looked mystical. It smelled medicinal. The line between the two was thin because it didn't need to exist. The plants themselves became allies in a long, patient negotiation with pain. Healers didn't treat illness as an enemy, but as imbalunsa, reminder that something in the body or spirit had slipped out of tune. The cure wasn't force. It was harmony restored through leaf, root, and whisper. Still, there were wounds too deep for herbs and prayers, moments when the bleeding wouldn't stop. The smell turned wrong, and infections set in like a curse. That's when the healers turned to something even older than plants: fire, smoke, and ash, the original antiseptics that purified both flesh and fear. Fire is the oldest surgeon humanity ever trusted, and the most impatient one. It purifies, sterilizes, cauterizes, and occasionally overdoes it. Before anyone had words like antiseptic or pathogen, people already knew that things touched by fire tended to stop rotting. Flesh burned cleanly didn't fester. Water boiled over embers didn't kill you. And so began the long, smoky partnership between medicine and flame. In many ancient cultures, fire wasn't just heat, it was a boundary. It separated the living from decay, the sacred from the unclean. To burn something was to send it through purification by ordeal. When healers leaned over a wound with a glowing iron, they weren't just sealing flesh. They were invoking that same logic, that the impurities, whatever they were, could be smoked out, burned off, sent away. Pain, unfortunately, was part of the bargain. Archaeologists have found cauterized skulls and limbs in every corner of the ancient world, from the Nile to the Andes. Egyptian healers heated bronze knives until they glowed, sealing battlefield gashes in seconds. Greek physicians did the same with rods and oil-soaked cloth. On other continents, smoke took the role of the blade. In the Amazon and parts of East Africa, herbal smoke was blown over wounds, not just for show, but because certain plants like sage, juniper, and cedar release phenolic compounds that actually kill bacteria. Thousands of years later, laboratories confirmed that those smoky rituals weren't symbolic. They were sanitation disguised as ceremony. Ash had its own reputation. Wood ash mixed with fat made soap long before the concept had a name, and powdered ash itself was sprinkled on wounds to dry them out and stop infection. In some Arctic and steppe cultures, where vegetation was scarce and snow covered everything, ash was literally the only antiseptic around, a fine grey dust carrying trace minerals and a surprisingly high pH. It stung like betrayal, but saved lives. The same knowledge turned up everywhere, different materials, same principle. Polynesian healers used volcanic ash. Indigenous North Americans sterilized bone tools in open flame. Medieval monks charred linen before applying it to open flesh. Across millennia and geography, everyone seemed to agree that fire, though unpredictable, was cleaner than rot. It was the one element that couldn't host disease. And it wasn't just about the flesh. Fire symbolized control over chaos. To bring flame into the healing space was to announce that order had arrived, that death, for now, would have to wait outside. The smoke rose, the hiss of burning resin filled the air, and suddenly, the wound wasn't just a wound, it was a battlefield being reclaimed. You can almost imagine the scent: pine, resin, blood, heat, the universal perfume of ancient medicine. To modern sensibilities, it all sounds medieval, barbaric even, but the numbers don't lie. People survived. Enough of them did that the method persisted for thousands of years. Pain, in that world, was proof of success. A silent wound was the dangerous one, and when the fire dimmed and the smoke cleared, there was always someone, the healer, who carried the smell of it on their skin, that mix of charred resin and labor. They weren't just doctors, they were intermediaries, standing between decay and renewal, because the moment the wound closed, another question opened: who, exactly, gave them the right, or the knowledge to do this? And that's where the figure of the healer stops being just practical and starts being sacred. Somewhere between the bone setter and the philosopher, between the herbalist and the witch, stood the healer, that ancient contradiction of logic and mystery wrapped in animal hide. Every society had one, and none entirely trusted them. They lived near the center of the camp, but never quite in it. You went to them when the body broke or the soul misbehaved, and you left with a bandaged wound and a feeling that you'd just witnessed something you weren't meant to understand. Healers were the first people to hold authority without a weapon. Their power came from knowledge and from the unsettling fact that they could touch blood without flinching. In the archaeological record, their presence lingers like smoke. Charms buried with the dead, tools stained with resin, ceremonial drums carved with the same hands that once stitched skin. They treated pain the way priests treated sin, through ritual, repetition, and a quiet kind of theater. Across continents, the pattern held. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Aipu chanted spells over wounds, blending surgery with incantation. In the Americas, the shaman's rattle drove off spirits, while a poultice of sage and clay drew out infection. In sub-Saharan Africa, Ngangas mixed herbs with prayer, invoking ancestors as if they were senior colleagues. Healing wasn't just chemical, it was moral, metaphysical, even political. Illness wasn't random, it was imbalance. Something in the world, or in you, had gone wrong, and the healer's job was to negotiate a ceasefire between body and cosmos. Of course, this came with complications. Success meant respect, failure meant suspicion. If a wound healed slowly, maybe it was cursed. If a patient died, maybe the healer had angered someone important, a spirit, a rival, or both. Many lived with one foot in reverence and the other in paranoia. Even in societies that honored them, healers were dangerous to befriend. Knowledge, after all, makes people nervous. Their methods blended precision and faith in ways modern medicine would later pretend to invent. A healer might begin by burning herbs to cleanse the space, then wash the wound in cool water, then whisper something halfway between a diagnosis and a prayer. None of it was arbitrary. The herbs killed microbes. The smoke disinfected the air. The words calmed the mind, which, as we now know, calms the body. Half science, half placebo, all survival. And yet, there was theater in it, the rhythm of the chant, the crackle of fire, the way the healer's eyes stayed fixed on the wound like it was confessing something. It wasn't deception. It was intention made visible. Healing required belief, not blind faith, but participation. A wound ignored refuses to close. A wound witnessed, tended, sung to, that one has a chance. The line between priest and doctor was so thin that in many languages it didn't exist. To cure was to cleanse. To diagnose was to divine. When people said the healer called the spirits, they weren't talking about fantasy. They were describing concentration, the art of focusing every sense on the fragile act of keeping another human alive. But the most curious thing about these healers is that they didn't work alone. Their rituals were accompanied by music, scent, and community, all of which, inconveniently for modern science, seemed to help. Healing wasn't private. It was public, rhythmic, and often loud enough to wake whatever gods were supposed to be paying attention. And those gods, as it turned out, responded better to rhythm than to logic. A principle healers used so often it eventually turned into something almost supernatural. The belief that sound itself could mend flesh. Words, in the hands of ancient healers, weren't decoration, they were instruments. Spoken in rhythm, whispered over a wound, or shouted into smoke, they had weight, direction, and occasionally measurable results. Every culture on Earth, at some point, decided that the voice could mend what the knife could not. It wasn't superstition. It was neurology, disguised as poetry. In ancient Mesopotamia, healers recited incantations to drive out the evil wind that caused sickness. Egyptian physicians read verses to invoke Sekhmet before applying honey and resin to burns. Among indigenous peoples of North America, chants accompanied the dressing of wounds, not as performance, but as synchronization. The words guided the healer's breath, which guided their movement, which guided the patient's pulse. In short, sound replaced anesthesia, rhythm replaced morphine, and belief became the first real sedative. Modern science, in its eternal effort to reinvent common sense, eventually proved what these healers already knew, that the body listens to tone. Lower voices calm the nervous system. Repetition reduces pain perception. And when someone stands beside you, chanting something steady, while pressing their palms over your wound, your body believes you're safe. The placebo effect, as we now call it, was once the entire treatment plan. These words weren't random syllables. They were scripts of order recited into chaos. The healer was conducting a kind of biological orchestra. The heartbeat, the breathing, the trembling. Some chants mimicked the rhythm of walking, others the beat of a drum. It wasn't metaphorical, it was physiological. The body began to match the music. It slowed, it aligned, it healed. Even when the words didn't make sense, the act did. In Siberia, shamans muttered entire phrases in spirit languages no one else could decipher. In Polynesia, healers sang in tones meant to mirror the ocean's pulse. Across West Africa, drums replaced words altogether, percussive speech that told the body what to do. These were not performances, they were protocols. It's easy to laugh at the idea of magic words, until you remember that modern doctors still say, "You'll be fine," and somehow that matters. The human brain, inconveniently, heals faster when it thinks someone competent is in charge. Ancient healers just took that principle seriously, to the point of composing entire songs around it. Sometimes the chants were paired with breath, slow exhalations over the wound, warm air mingling with herbs and smoke. Breath carried intention, and intention carried energy. The belief was simple: life leaves through the mouth, so life can be returned through it too. And while today we might call that symbolic, it's also oxygen therapy in disguise. The line between biology and ritual blurred beautifully. The body didn't care if the words were sacred or scientific. It just needed reassurance that someone was paying attention. Every syllable was a signal that the world still made sense, that pain had an audience, that chaos was being managed. And when the chanting stopped, the silence that followed was its own medicine. Because that's when the healer began to use another teacher, one even older than language, the animal world. Creatures that never sang, never prayed, yet somehow always knew how to heal. Animals were the first teachers of medicine, and humans, as usual, learned by eavesdropping. Long before healers wrote anything down, they watched the furred and feathered experts deal with pain in their own practical, unsentimental ways. A wounded bear would dig up roots and chew them. A deer bitten by snakes would seek out a specific herb. Birds bathed in ash. Wolves licked each other's wounds. There were no theories, no prayers, no applause, just efficiency. And someone was paying attention. Anthropologists call it zoopharmacognosy, which sounds like a word invented to impress ground committees, but it simply means animals knowing what medicine is. Early humans noticed that injured creatures survived by doing specific repeatable things, rolling in clay, licking sap, pressing moss to wounds, and copied them. Nature became the first medical school, and the curriculum was brutal but clear. If it worked, it stayed. Take honey, for instance. Bears raided hives not only for sugar, but for the antiseptic coating that came with it. Humans followed suit. Soon, honey was being spread on cuts from Egypt to the Arctic. Modern labs later confirmed that honey kills bacteria, seals moisture, and even prevents infection from antibiotic-resistant strains. Translation: every bear who smeared itself in honey after a fight was basically doing clinical research. Then there was clay. Wounded animals rolled in mud, not for comfort, but because certain clays draw out infection and neutralize toxins. People caught on quickly. In ancient Mesopotamia and North Africa, healers packed wounds with river clay and wrapped them in reeds, the ancient equivalent of a detox spa, except it worked. In the Andes, llama herders used volcanic earth the same way. In all cases, the logic was the same. Cool, dry, and mineral-rich beats wet, warm, and infected. Even fats found their place. Hunters noticed that wounded animals licked the marrow of fallen prey, and soon after, humans began using animal fat as a base for salves. Bear grease, seal oil, rendered tallow. These were the vaselines of prehistory. Fat sealed the skin from air, kept wounds moist enough to heal, and acted as a carrier for herbal compounds. The side effect was smelling like dinner, but in the hierarchy of survival, aesthetics ranked low. Observation of animals didn't stop at ingredients. It extended to behavior. Wolves rested after injury. Humans learned that movement reopens wounds. Cats cleaned obsessively. Humans discovered hygiene. Horses huddled together in storms. Humans invented convalescence. The healer's greatest tool wasn't a plant or a charm. It was the ability to imitate. There's something humbling about that, isn't there? The species that would one day invent antibiotics and MRI scanners began its medical career by watching a wounded dog lick itself better. But imitation turned into innovation. Once people understood that healing came from materials around them, they started to refine, to extract resins, crush roots, boil bones, filter honey. They took what they learned from nature's experiments and started running their own. And as this knowledge deepened, so did their understanding of anatomy. After all, once you start cutting open an animal to see what's wrong, curiosity becomes a dangerous habit. Soon enough, someone was setting bones, stitching tendons, and realizing that the body, for all its mystery, was mostly plumbing and patience. At some point, curiosity crossed the line from herbalism to engineering. Once humans realized the body wasn't a sacred mystery but a complicated piece of wet architecture, surgery was inevitable. The earliest healers who dared to cut flesh weren't reckless. They were observant to the point of obsession. Hunters had given them front row seats to anatomy long before the first wound ever demanded a suture. They knew how muscle wrapped around bone, how tendons snapped like bowstrings, how blood pulsed rhythmically when you pressed too deep. Killing had, inconveniently, taught them how to keep others alive. You can see the evidence in the bones. Archaeologists have unearthed skulls with neatly drilled holes, trepanations, perfectly circular, edges smoothed by healing, which means not only did someone survive having a hole carved into their skull, but someone else was skilled enough to do it without hitting anything vital. This wasn't savagery, it was precision work, done with stone tools sharper than modern scalpels. And while we still don't know exactly why they did it, to relieve pressure, treat seizures, or evict unwanted spirits, the fact remains, they pulled it off. Often, elsewhere, bones were set with astonishing care. Splints made from reeds, bark or bone were bound with sinew or plant fiber, early orthopedics without the jargon. In ancient Egypt, Medical papyri described how to diagnose dislocations by comparing symmetry. Across the world, in the Andes, healers immobilized fractures using llama wool soaked in resins that hardened like primitive plaster. When X-rays thousands of years later revealed healed breaks perfectly aligned, the conclusion was hard to deny. Someone understood anatomy long before anatomy books existed. Suturing came next, delicate threadwork done with gut, hair, or plant fiber. Healers noticed that wounds closed faster when edges were drawn together, and that some materials held without rotting. Animal sinew became the gold standard, literally binding life back into flesh. The process was simple: puncture, pull, tie, hope. The results were remarkable. Infection, of course, was a constant threat, but that's what fire, smoke, and honey were for. And then there were the tools. Needles carved from bone, obsidian blades, sharper than surgical steel, shells used as clamps. In some regions, ants served as living sutures. Their jaws used to pinch skin shut before their bodies were snapped off, leaving the heads in place like natural staples. Modern medicine calls this innovation. Ancient healers called it Tuesday. They didn't separate the practical from the spiritual either. Surgery was performed in ritual spaces, not out of piety but respect, because opening a body was opening a boundary. Words were spoken, herbs burned, not to impress the gods but to steady the hands. The sound of chanting helped control rhythm and breathing, a prehistoric form of stress management. Even then, the best surgeons knew that calm hands cut cleaner. It's easy to romanticize all this, but the reality was brutal. No anesthesia, no sterile gloves, no margin for error. The patient either survived or became a lesson. Still, the success rates are unnervingly good. Some of those skulls show full recovery, bone regrown, life continued. It's almost unsettling, the idea that people in furs and ash did brain surgery with fewer infections than 18th century Europeans armed with science. And yet, surgery was only part of the story. Healing wasn't just about fixing what broke. It was about listening to pain itself, that insistent, stubborn messenger the body sends when something needs attention. Ancient healers didn't silence it, they interpreted it. Pain, for most of human history, wasn't the villain, it was the courier. It arrived uninvited, stayed too long, and made its point in ways nobody could ignore. But it carried information. Modern medicine treats pain like a malfunction, a problem to be silenced. Ancient healers, on the other hand, treated it like a language, one the body used when logic ran out of vocabulary. Every culture had a philosophy about it. Among the Inuit, endurance of pain was strength, a quiet demonstration of harmony between flesh and spirit. In India, the Ayurvedic texts described pain as the cry of imbalance in the doshas, the body's internal forces. In the Amazon, pain was the spirit's way of asking for acknowledgement. Even Hippocrates, the Greek rationalist, described pain not as an intruder, but as the voice of nature. The point wasn't to destroy it, it was to understand it, then convince it to leave politely. Healers had no painkillers in the modern sense, so they improvised. Poppies were chewed, kava brewed, coca leaves pressed between gums, and fermented drinks offered with suspicious generosity. But the real art lay in distraction, music, rhythm, hypnosis disguised as ritual. Drums thudded like heartbeats, voices murmured in hypnotic repetition. It was less about numbing and more about tricking the nervous system into cooperation. The mind could be persuaded to turn down the volume of agony if it believed it was being cared for. Pain rituals could look absurdly theatrical to outsiders. A healer might wave a feather over a wound or chant into smoke, but under the surface, there was logic. The sound gave the sufferer something to anchor to. The scent of burning herbs released mild anesthetics. The repetitive rhythm slowed breathing. They were manipulating chemistry through belief, placebo, endorphins, hypnosis, and theology, all playing in the same orchestra. In some societies, pain wasn't just tolerated, it was sacred. It proved resilience, connection, and transformation. Among the Plains tribes, wounds were part of ceremony, reminders that healing and suffering were twins. In Polynesia, tattooing rituals marked not just identity but the acceptance of pain as life's price of beauty and belonging. A person who endured pain without panic was considered spiritually mature, someone who'd learned not to argue with the body's warnings but to coexist with them. The healer's job wasn't to eliminate pain completely, but to keep it from becoming meaningless. Pain that teaches is useful. Pain that dominates destroys. The trick was turning suffering into signal, a process modern psychology, with all its jargon, is still trying to imitate. Even their anesthetics came with balance in mind: poppy juice to calm, willow bark to soothe, smoke to cleanse, and touch, human warmth to remind the brain it wasn't alone in its misery. You can almost picture the scene: a wounded hunter, sweating through fever, a healer's hand on his chest, voice low and rhythmic, herbs steaming nearby. No morphine, no sterile light, just the steady conversation between body and mind, translated through breath. And somehow, it worked. Not always, but enough to make survival possible. Because underneath the rituals and the remedies was one unshakable idea: the body wants to live. Pain wasn't sabotage, it was communication. Ignore it, and you die. Listen, and you adapt. And that understanding led to something even more profound: the realization that recovery didn't belong to the individual at all. It belonged to the group. Healing was never solitary. It was communal, rhythmic, and deeply human. Healing, in the old sense, was never private. You didn't close the door and suffer quietly. Illness belonged to everyone: the family, the clan, the village, sometimes the entire settlement if the patient was particularly dramatic. A wound wasn't just a body problem. It was a community event. Everyone had a part to play: the healer to guide, the family to hold, the spirits to be consulted, and the neighbors to hum reassuringly in the background. It was medicine by orchestra, and everyone knew the tune. Among the Navajo, for instance, sickness was treated with Chantway's elaborate healing rituals that could last days. Hundreds of songs, sand paintings, and symbolic gestures wove body and spirit back into harmony. In sub-Saharan Africa, Ngoma ceremonies gathered whole villages to dance, sing, and exorcise illness through rhythm. In Polynesia, healers recited genealogies as part of the cure, a reminder that the patient was never alone, that their pain was threaded into the lives of ancestors. Everywhere you look, the same pattern emerges. Healing wasn't about isolation. It was about reintegration. From an anthropological angle, it makes perfect sense. Collective attention triggers safety. Safety triggers rest. Rest triggers healing. Modern science now calls it social buffering, but ancient people didn't need the vocabulary. They could see it. A patient surrounded by warmth recovered faster. The heartbeat slowed, fever broke, and the will to live, that most fragile medicine, returned. The ceremonies themselves were marvels of choreography. The healer stood at the center like a conductor, timing the chants to the flicker of the fire. Drummers followed the rhythm of breath. Voices rose and fell in controlled waves, designed to lull the mind into something like trance. Herbs burned, not just for symbolism, but to release antimicrobial smoke. Meanwhile, the patient lay at the heart of it all, trembling, sweating, half dreaming, held in sound and smell and collective focus. You could almost call it hypnosis powered by empathy. And there was always humor. Even in the solemnity of ritual, laughter played its part. Someone would tease the patient for getting into trouble again. A child might giggle at the smoke. An elder would mutter about spirits who don't know when to quit. That levity wasn't accidental. It reminded everyone that the world still contained lightness, that the person wasn't being mourned but reabsorbed into life. In psychological terms, it was genius. In human terms, it was love disguised as ritual. Healers understood that sickness created distance between a person and their community, between a body and its own confidence. The ceremony closed those gaps. When dozens of hands passed food, adjusted blankets, sang into the same air, the message was unmistakable: you are still part of us. That alone could tilt the balance between life and death. It's no wonder then that when colonizers or missionaries arrived and insisted healing was a solitary, sterile affair, something went missing. The act of curing survived, the act of belonging didn't, and so modern medicine, for all its brilliance, became strangely lonely. The old ways remind us that health isn't just physical, it's relational, because once the singing stopped and the fire dimmed, something larger than the wound had closed. The patient might still ache, but the silence that followed was full of breath, warmth, and the collective exhale of a group that had just fought the universe back into balance. And in that silence lay the final truth of all ancient medicine, that every cure, no matter how small, was part of a much older conversation between the living and the world that kept them alive. A conversation that never really ended, just evolved. The bones of old healers still whisper through modern hospitals. You just have to listen past the latex and fluorescent light. Every time a nurse calms a patient before a procedure, every time a surgeon burns tissue to stop bleeding, every time someone presses honey onto a wound because it works better than ointment, you're hearing the echo of knowledge far older than science. For all our progress, the fundamentals haven't changed much. We still clean, seal, soothe, and wait. The ingredients are fancier, the containers sterile, but the logic is prehistoric. Antibiotics are just purified molds. Antiseptics are concentrated herbs. Even anesthetics trace back to the same plants that shamans and herbalists once crushed in their palms. It turns out civilization's greatest breakthroughs were less inventions than rediscoveries. What nature had already filed neatly under obvious. But it's not just the chemistry that endured, it's the worldview. The idea that healing is balance, not conquest. That illness has meaning, not just cause. That community and belief aren't superstitions but biological assets. Somewhere along the line, medicine forgot that part, or maybe it was edited out for efficiency. After all, it's hard to patent empathy. When anthropologists talk about traditional medicine, they often mean something quaint: herbs, chants, feathers, clay. But what they're really describing is humanity's first attempt to systematize compassion. Those early healers weren't just mixing leaves and murmuring prayers. They were testing hypotheses, mapping the invisible relationship between body, environment, and mind. Their laboratories were forests, their instruments the senses, their textbooks the people who lived or didn't. Of course, the modern world owes them a debt it rarely admits. The pharmaceutical industry was built on the backs of their recipes. Quinine from Andean bark, aspirin from willow, anesthetics from coca leaves, antiseptics from pine resin. What once got dismissed as folklore became biochemistry the moment a lab coat entered the room. Civilization has a habit of rediscovering the wheel and then claiming royalties. Still, something of their wisdom survived in the margins, in the quiet insistence that healing requires participation, that recovery isn't what doctors do to patients, but what humans do together against entropy. That maybe, just maybe, a song, a hand, or a breath still matters, even in a world of machines. There's irony in how the same cultures once called primitive now provide the blueprints for medicine's future. Indigenous pharmacology guides, immunology research, shamanic trance studies inform psychotherapy, communal care models inspire trauma recovery. What once looked mystical now looks measurable. The difference is only vocabulary. The legacy of those ancient healers isn't stored in museums. It's alive every time someone looks at pain and decides not to panic. It's there in the grandmother who still boils herbs for her grandchild's cough, in the doctor who touches a patient's shoulder before surgery, in the slow, wordless confidence that healing isn't just chemistry, it's communication. And maybe that's the lesson buried beneath all those millennia of blood, smoke, and whispered prayers. The body can't tell the difference between care that's scientific and care that's sincere. It only knows whether it's being tended to. Because even now, under all the technology, we're still the same fragile, stubborn species, huddled around the same ancient fire, doing everything we can to keep the dark at bay. Strength has always been overrated, at least the loud kind of strength, the one that breaks things to prove it can. For most of human history, the real survivors weren't the biggest or the fiercest. They were the ones who could sit still, share heat, and wait without falling apart. The ones who knew that silence feeds the body better than panic. Archaeology is blunt about it. The people who lived longest weren't the strongest. They were the most coordinated. It's a difficult truth to swallow for a species obsessed with competition. Evolutionary myth loves to tell the story of the lone, muscular genius dragging the tribe toward progress. Reality was quieter. The Neanderthals, for example, had the muscle mass of Olympic lifters and the lung capacity of endurance athletes. They hunted mammoths and survived Ice Age winters until they didn't. Meanwhile, their smaller, less robust cousins, the anatomically modern humans, spent more time sharing tools, food, and ideas. Guess which ones you're descended from? It wasn't strength that survived the Pleistocene, it was communication. Even Darwin, often misquoted as the prophet of aggression, wrote that survival depended on adaptability, which, in practice, meant flexibility, empathy, and the ability to cooperate under stress. The tribes that shared warmth and food in the lean months made it through. The ones that didn't became footnotes. In evolutionary terms, kindness wasn't sentimental, it was practical. People who worked together didn't die as quickly, and that's as close to immortality as nature allows. Bones tell the same story. In Paleolithic burial sites, skeletons show healed fractures, missing limbs, arthritis, the kind of injuries that would have been fatal without help. Someone had to feed those people, keep them warm, carry them from one season to the next. Cooperation left its signature in calcium. Every bone that healed wrong but healed anyway is a fossilized testimony that someone cared enough to wait. It's ironic that modern humans romanticize rugged individualism, when the very DNA that built civilization came from the opposite impulse, the quiet urge to stay near others. Prehistoric strength was measured in endurance, not dominance. The hunter who could sprint the fastest didn't guarantee survival. The group that stayed put long enough to conserve energy and plan did. Those long hours of stillness around a fire weren't laziness, they were strategy. The myth of the strong survivor didn't exist then. The strong didn't last. They burned out early, overhunted, froze. The patient endured. In a world where storms could erase a landscape overnight, stillness was adaptation. People learned that the body can only do so much, but a calm mind, especially one surrounded by others, could outlast almost anything. Even now, traces of that ancient rhythm linger. Our heartbeats sync with those nearby. Our breathing slows when we're surrounded by warmth. The body remembers the physics of togetherness. Every campfire, every circle, every pause around shared silence was a survival tool disguised as comfort. The future was built not by warriors but by the ones who knew how to wait out the dark without turning on each other. And waiting, the deliberate, intelligent kind, became its own form of mastery, because stillness wasn't absence. It was observation, the ability to read the wind, hear the snow, sense the animal before it appeared. That discipline, the art of not moving when everything inside you screamed to run, became humanity's quiet superpower. Movement attracts attention. Every creature that's ever survived a predator knows this instinctively, though humans had to learn it the hard way, through the kind of lessons that leave teeth marks. Long before we invented camouflage, before we had traps or spears fine enough to matter, the smartest thing a person could do was to become invisible by staying still. Stillness wasn't weakness, it was intelligence performed in slow motion. In the wild, silence was a strategy. On the open plains, a flick of hair in the wind could betray a hunter to a herd. In the Arctic, one misplaced breath condensed into a plume that shouted alive against the white horizon. The San of southern Africa mastered the art of vanishing by blending motion with landscape, freezing mid-step when an antelope lifted its head, holding posture so long that muscles forgot they existed. Among Arctic peoples, hunters waited beside ice holes for seals to surface, motionless for hours, sometimes days. Heartbeats slowed to the rhythm of the water. The difference between dinner and starvation often came down to who twitched first. Stillness wasn't just about hiding, it was about learning. By stopping, people could finally listen to what the world was already saying, the subtle warnings in wind direction, bird flight, or the crackle of branches before a storm. The Kung, for instance, could detect distant animal movement through sound vibrations most modern ears would mistake for silence. Aboriginal trackers read entire stories in footprints by kneeling motionless until dust settled enough to reveal direction. The body became an antenna tuned to frequencies long forgotten by city life. Even rest became a form of vigilance. Sleeping patterns in hunter-gatherer societies weren't deep or solitary. People drifted in and out of half-sleep through the night, overlapping consciousness like a woven mat. Someone was always awake, listening. It wasn't paranoia, it was social radar. Stillness didn't mean shutting down. It meant becoming permeable to the environment, part of the landscape rather than apart from it. The irony is that in a world built on motion, the hunt, the chase, the migration, survival, belonged to those who could pause. Every successful hunter, every long-lived elder, every thriving community understood the same thing. Rushing was expensive, food wasted, energy burned, mistakes multiplied. The earth favored the patient. Even predators practiced it. Big cats didn't win by strength, they won by silence. Human hunters copied them, not out of admiration but necessity. In the end, stillness wasn't imitation, it was evolution. The nervous survived less often than the observant. And when stillness became collective, when a group moved or waited as one, it turned from tactic into art. Imagine an entire camp freezing mid-conversation because a single person heard something shift in the dark, the air tightening, the fire dimming, dozens of bodies suspended in alert, quiet. That kind of unity wasn't accidental. It was the result of generations trained to recognize that survival wasn't speed, it was synchronization. Eventually, those moments of shared stillness began to center around something more than fear or hunting. They gathered around light. Fire, especially, demanded stillness to tend it, to protect it, to let it teach rhythm to a restless species. And it was around those quiet flames that humanity discovered the deeper purpose of stopping, not just to survive, but to stay. If there's a single invention that made humanity stop running, it was fire. Not for cooking or scaring predators, though those were pleasant side effects, but because fire forced stillness, you couldn't carry it far. You had to build around it, wait beside it, and feed it like a living thing. It made us gather, linger, and for the first time, look at each other without the excuse of work. Civilization didn't start with tools or farming. It started with people sitting quietly, staring at light. Archaeologists can trace the earliest fire pits back nearly 1 million years. Little circles of scorched earth ringed by stones and bones. They're the first clear sign of social organization. To maintain a flame, you needed shifts, someone to feed it, someone to guard it, someone to scold whoever forgot to bring wood. It turned survival from an individual challenge into a collective performance. Around the fire, strength didn't matter, patience did. And the fire itself changed us. Its warmth rewired our nights, extending wakefulness and shrinking fear. Predators kept their distance, and so did the dark. In the glow, people began to tell stories, share food, and plan hunts. The flickering light invited conversation but demanded stillness. Any sudden motion could scatter sparks or stir smoke, so they learned to be still together, breathing in rhythm with the crackle. The first classrooms, the first theaters, the first governments, all probably formed around the same flames. There's evidence of this in how ancient hearths were built. Circular, communal, deliberately placed at the camp's center. The fire wasn't just warmth, it was structure. It organized space, defined belonging. To sit near it was to be part of the group. To sit outside the circle was exile. The fire became a boundary between chaos and order, wild and human, night and memory. It also slowed time, hunting, scavenging, fleeing, all that required motion. Fire, on the other hand, encouraged waiting. You couldn't rush a meal roasted on embers. You couldn't hurry storytelling or song. It imposed a new kind of rhythm, deliberate, cyclic, hypnotic. People started to measure time in coals, one tale per log, one meal per flame. In the stillness, thought deepened, speech lengthened, and somewhere between a spark and a sigh, imagination was born. Even our bodies changed. Anthropologists argue that cooked food reduced the time spent chewing, freeing energy for the brain. In short, we got smarter because we sat down. Fire made us reflective, literally and figuratively. Its light illuminated faces, not prey. And when people looked at one another across the glow, something ancient shifted empathy. For the first time, survival wasn't about who could run fastest, but who could stay awake longest, guarding the light while others slept. It's strangely poetic that our greatest evolutionary leap came from sitting in one place, managing something fragile. We learned discipline, attention, and cooperation because a single spark demanded it. And that habit of gathering close, breathing slowly, staying still, didn't end when the flames went out. It seeped into everything. Because once humanity learned how to survive by staying together, someone had to keep that knowledge alive, not in battlefields or hunts, but in memory. And that responsibility often fell to those the world underestimated, the ones who didn't move much, but remembered everything. Every society likes to pretend its survival came from heroes, the hunters, the warriors, the ones who roared against the elements. But if you dig just a little beneath the bones and tools, you find the truth was much quieter. Survival depended not on those who chased mammoths, but on those who stayed, the women who preserved, the elders who remembered, and the children who learned by watching. History just forgot to put them in the front row. While men tracked animals across frozen plains, someone had to keep the fire alive, patch clothes, soothe fevers, and ration food with the precision of an accountant. That someone was usually a woman with an infant on her hip and a weather forecast in her bones. She could tell when snow was coming by the way dogs slept, when water would freeze by the sound of the wind on hide. Her strength wasn't loud, it was logistical, and logistics, not heroism, kept humanity fed. Elders carried another kind of knowledge, not how to chase, but how to endure. Their memories were libraries of famine and frost, patterns of migration, edible roots, healing herbs, and mistakes nobody wanted to repeat. Archaeological digs show that many Paleolithic communities cared for the elderly long past, their physical usefulness. They were walking archives. Killing a mammoth was luck. Remembering where they passed last year's ice melt, that was skill. Even the children mattered more than their small hands suggested. They were the apprentices, the future of every habit that worked. You can see it in how traditional societies still teach, through repetition, through proximity, not lectures. A child who watched her grandmother grind bark into salve wasn't learning chemistry, but she was preserving medicine. The process of sitting, observing, waiting, that was the education system. Stillness wasn't idleness, it was study. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer groups today often notice something modern people find unbearable: long stretches of silence. No small talk, no nervous chatter, just the sound of breathing, rustling, and life being managed without commentary. But inside that quiet was a dense exchange of attention. A girl stirring a pot learned texture by smell. A boy mending nets learned tension by feel. Learning was transmission through stillness, and the division of labor wasn't as rigid as stereotypes suggest. Women hunted small game, men gathered roots when food was scarce, children scouted paths. The crucial quality wasn't strength, but awareness. It's telling that in many indigenous languages, the words for wise, old, and quiet share the same root. Knowledge accumulated in silence, like snow. When the hunters returned, tired and half-frozen, they stepped into the warmth built by people who hadn't moved all day, people who had managed the invisible infrastructure of life. It was their stillness that made the noise of the hunt possible. In that sense, civilization's foundation wasn't built on muscle, but on memory, a living continuity passed hand to hand, like embers between generations. Those embers weren't only symbolic, they were literal: shared heat, shared breath, shared sleep. Because before architecture, before shelter had walls, the first structure humans ever built was each other. The human body itself became the first refuge, the first insulation against a cold, indifferent world. Before humans mastered stone or wood, before architecture learned to defy the wind, the body was the only house anyone had, and the only one that worked when the temperature dropped below mercy. Warmth wasn't an object, it was an arrangement. People didn't survive alone under furs or inside huts. They survived by pressing close enough to merge. Shared heat was the first currency, traded instinctively, like breath. In Ice Age caves, skeletons are found clustered together, limbs intertwined, bones overlapping so tightly it's impossible to separate family from survival strategy. Across the Arctic, the same pattern persists in living memory. People sleeping in circles, children in the middle, adults radiating outward like insulation. In the Great Plains, winter lodges positioned sleeping mats by rank of vulnerability, infants at the center, elders beside the fire, hunters forming a living wall against drafts. It wasn't affection, it was thermodynamics. Touch meant energy retention, and energy retention meant another sunrise. The human body is, in fact, an excellent heater, 37 degrees Celsius of portable climate control. Alone, it dissipates quickly. Together, it creates an ecosystem. Modern physiology now confirms what ancient people already practiced. Proximity slows metabolism, lowers stress hormones, stabilizes breathing. In simple terms, warmth isn't just heat, it's synchronization. The group heartbeat, literally, becomes the hearth. Even animals knew it. Arctic foxes curled into spirals. Penguins rotated through huddles with mathematical fairness. Humans watched, learned, and improved. Early sleeping arrangements were social choreography, not comfort, but equilibrium. No one truly slept deeply. They drifted in overlapping rhythms, sharing warmth like a chain of small suns. This intimacy bred something beyond survival. Attachment, warmth, and love became chemically inseparable. The hormone oxytocin, released through touch, made cooperation feel good, evolution's quiet bribe to keep people close. Empathy wasn't born from ideology, it was born from winter. You cared for others because, quite literally, they kept you alive. The earliest moral system was temperature regulation. Touch had language, too. A hand on a shoulder, a body pressed near yours, the shared breath of sleep, all spoke safety in a dialect older than speech. Anthropologists studying traditional Arctic and subarctic families still find that physical closeness is both practical and emotional, an unbroken continuum from survival to comfort. When modern people romanticize closeness to nature, they usually forget this part, that nature once demanded closeness to each other. Architecture eventually took over the job, but never completely. Houses just became larger bodies, walls as skin, fire as metabolism. Yet even now, in storms or disasters, people instinctively revert to the old system. They huddle. It's muscle memory from a time when heat was trust, and trust was survival. The irony is that civilization taught us to fear proximity, to value space, privacy, independence, as though isolation were a mark of progress. But the body still remembers the older logic. When loneliness spikes, temperature perception drops. When touch returns, warmth follows. Biology remains loyal to its origins. The body as shelter wasn't just metaphor, it was physics, biology, and anthropology converging on a single truth. No one survives the night alone. And through that stillness, that breath-shared body-linked quiet, people learned to listen. Not to speech, not even to each other, but to the landscape itself. Because the world, it turned out, had its own way of whispering instructions to those who stayed still long enough to hear. The earth never stopped speaking. People just got too loud to hear it. In the beginning, survival depended on listening, not metaphorically, but with the kind of attention that borders on devotion. Before maps, before clocks, before even the idea of weather, there was sound. The shift of wind through grass, the warning creak of ice, the peculiar stillness before an animal bolted. The world hummed with instruction. Those who stayed still enough to notice lived. Those who didn't became lessons. Hunter-gatherers, for all their mobility, were experts in silence. The San of southern Africa could interpret an entire story from the faint crack of a twig. Not just that something moved, but what, when, and how long ago. Inuit hunters on the Arctic sea ice could tell the difference between the groan of shifting floes and the hollow echo of a seal's breathing hole beneath their feet. Aboriginal trackers in Australia read the landscape like text, the texture of sand, the angle of a shadow, the pattern of insect trails. Each cue spoke softly, but together they formed a language older than speech. To listen well required stillness of both body and mind. Early humans spent long hours motionless, watching the horizon, breathing through their noses to avoid fogging the air. That patience, that strange disciplined inactivity, became the foundation of environmental intelligence. People learned not to impose themselves on the world, but to fit within its tempo. The land revealed itself only to those who didn't interrupt. Anthropologists sometimes describe this as attentive, quiet, a kind of learned humility toward the environment. But to ancient societies, it was simply etiquette. Noise, frightened prey, disturbed spirits, broke the equilibrium between humans and everything else alive. Silence wasn't absence, it was participation. The act of not speaking was itself communication with animals, with wind, with the unseen, and the benefits were practical. Those who observed quietly could predict migration routes, sense weather shifts, and detect predators long before danger arrived. Survival wasn't about domination, it was about resonance. People synchronized themselves with their surroundings, and in doing so, erased the boundary between self and landscape. It wasn't mystical, it was ecological logic wrapped in poetry. The irony, of course, is that modern society measures intelligence by how quickly someone answers, while early humanity measured it by how long someone could wait. Listening was data collection, patience turned into precision. The best tracker wasn't the one who spotted the most, but the one who missed the least. Even rituals of silence carried this practicality. Before hunts or journeys, some tribes observed periods of complete quiet. It wasn't superstition, it was calibration, tuning minds to the frequencies of the world outside. Because once motion began, every unnecessary sound was a liability. Stillness became both preparation and protection. Listening to the land wasn't about reverence, though it often looked like that, but about survival through sensitivity. You didn't have to conquer the world when you could cooperate with it. Every rustle, every shift, every breath of wind was an ally, provided you stayed still long enough to understand what it meant. And over generations, that discipline, that sacred patience evolved into something cultural, even spiritual. Stillness became ritualized, encoded into ceremony. Waiting turned into worship, not because the land demanded it, but because humans needed to remember it. The art of silence wasn't about reverence alone, it was rehearsal for endurance. And from that rehearsal came a new kind of strength, the ability to wait through hunger, storms, scarcity, not by fighting, but by aligning with the slow pulse of the world itself. Somewhere along the timeline, waiting stopped being an inconvenience and became a discipline. In early societies, time wasn't managed, it was endured. The sun, the seasons, the animals, everything moved in cycles that refused to be rushed. And so people adapted by learning the one skill that separated survivors from casualties: restraint. The world rewarded those who could pause without collapsing. Waiting wasn't passive. It was structured, often ritualized, and deeply social. Fasting before a hunt wasn't just about superstition. It kept the senses sharp and the body quiet. Sitting in silence before planting season wasn't laziness. It was calibration with the soil's temperature and the insect's timing. Life operated on cues too delicate for haste to perceive. A good community didn't conquer time, it conformed to it. In Arctic camps, people waited weeks for herds to move. They repaired tools, sang softly, and watched the snow's color change to predict migration. In desert cultures, nomads learned to rest through the heat rather than fight it. In the tropics, waiting for rain was its own ceremony. One part prayer, one part meteorology, all patience. In every case, restraint kept the species alive. Even the act of hunting, that quintessential image of action, was mostly waiting. A hunter might spend 12 hours beside a watering hole without moving a muscle, heart rate dropping to that of the earth around him. This was endurance training disguised as meditation. Success wasn't measured in muscle, but in the ability to merge with the environment's tempo. Those who fidgeted starved. Communal life mirrored this rhythm. In the evenings, after the day's small victories, the tribe gathered not to celebrate but to synchronize. Drums pulsed in steady repetition. Songs stretched into monotony. Firelight flickered in loops. These weren't performances. They were lessons in collective patience. The music taught breathing. The repetition taught humility. In that hypnotic slowness, people remembered how to exist without needing to move. And it wasn't just practical, it was emotional engineering. Waiting together bound people. A shared pause dissolved hierarchy. Everyone, hunter or child, sat before the same fire, subject to the same rhythm. The ritual said, "We will outlast time by matching it." Anthropologists studying these ceremonies still note their psychological precision. Waiting wasn't empty. It was filled with anticipation, awareness, and the soothing recognition that nothing, not hunger, not fear, lasts forever. Even the myths reflected this tempo. Creation stories across cultures begin with stillness. The cosmic pause before the world began. The breath held before sound. Movement always follows silence, not the other way around. The universe itself seemed to reward restraint. Modern society, in contrast, treats stillness like failure. The pause before productivity resumes. But ancient people knew that motion without rhythm is chaos. You can see the difference in how they treated scarcity. When food ran low, they slowed down. When animals migrated away, they waited. No panic, no overreach. Their patience wasn't saintly, it was mathematical. Energy wasted on anxiety was energy not spent on survival. In a sense, restraint was their calendar, their clock, their religion. And when the world eventually warmed, when the herds returned or the rains fell, the patient was still alive to see it. The impatient weren't. That instinct to slow down, to trust the rhythm instead of fighting it, carried over into every form of community life. Even danger, when it came, was met not with flight, but with togetherness. Because if waiting built endurance, unity turned it into safety. For early humans, solitude wasn't peaceful, it was a sentence. To be alone meant exposure, silence without witnesses, and the kind of fear that seeps into bone. Every predator had better teeth, every storm more patience, every night colder than pride. Isolation was death's waiting room, and no one wanted a seat there. The group wasn't optional, it was oxygen. You can see it even in the archaeology. Skeletons found buried with care, placed in fetal positions, covered with ochre, surrounded by tools or flowers, belonged to those who were loved. The bones of the forgotten, left scattered or gnawed, belonged to those who died alone. Togetherness left fingerprints. So did exile. And in small-scale societies, being cast out wasn't just punishment. It was removal from the very mechanism that kept people alive. Hunter-gatherers survived through networked vigilance. One person gathered food, another tended fire, another watched the horizon. No single individual could manage it all. A lone human can't hear predators approaching from behind, can't carry enough water, can't stay awake through a full night. The mathematics of survival demanded company. You might be skilled, but you'd still die of exhaustion. That's why cooperation wasn't a moral invention. It was an evolutionary one. Anthropologists studying the ache, the hadza, or the kung find the same rule repeated. Food is shared, not out of generosity, but because everyone takes turns being unlucky. One day you come back empty-handed, the next day you feed the group. Isolation breaks that system. The myth of the self-sufficient survivor, the one who triumphs alone in the wilderness, would have baffled your ancestors. They'd have called it suicide with good posture. Even emotional life was shaped by this dependence. Loneliness, as we now know, doesn't just hurt, it kills. It raises blood pressure, suppresses immunity, shortens lifespan. Biology still treats separation as an emergency. Our brains release the same panic chemicals as when we face physical threat. The body doesn't differentiate between being chased by a bear and being left out of the fire circle. Both mean danger. In ancient camps, social exile was used sparingly, precisely because it was crueler than execution. To be without others was to vanish into the noise of the world, a creature with no echo. Humans evolved to exist in chorus. Even silence was communal. Isolation made it unbearable. That's why the fire, the songs, the rituals mattered so much. They weren't entertainment. They were the glue that kept people from dissolving back into the landscape. And this collective instinct for togetherness became a force stronger than muscle or weaponry. It meant sharing when resources were scarce, rotating guards through exhaustion, warming children that weren't your own. Cooperation was a kind of unspoken contract. You keep me alive, and I'll return the favor. Over time, that turned into empathy, morality, and something dangerously close to love. Modern society has mostly forgotten how dangerous isolation is. We've traded communal vigilance for individual pride, and wonder why anxiety feels like hunger. The body still remembers what the brain denies. That alone is unsafe. Civilization might have built walls, but evolution never stopped expecting the sound of others breathing nearby. In the end, survival wasn't about running fastest or fighting hardest. It was about forming a circle, about knowing that one person's stillness was another's safety. And that circle of warmth, of patience, of shared presence was the real human invention. But eventually, that circle started to crack. Movement replaced presence, noise drowned silence, and stillness, the old, sacred strength, was mistaken for weakness. The very trait that had carried humanity through millennia began to vanish beneath the sound of its own progress. Somewhere between the hum of engines and the glow of screens, humanity forgot how to sit still. The same species that once survived ice ages by staying quiet through storms now panics if the Wi-Fi flickers. The body, built for patience, became allergic to stillness. Motion turned from necessity into compulsion, a nervous tick disguised as progress. It started innocently enough. Agriculture, cities, clocks, each invention was a small rebellion against waiting. Why watch the sky for signs of rain when you can irrigate? Why follow herds when you can pen them in? Slowly, the rhythm of the world stopped being something humans matched and became something they tried to outpace. Movement became the new measure of worth. To stay still was to fall behind. But the trade-off was brutal. Constant motion severed humanity's oldest contracts with nature, with community, with the body itself. Nomads once moved with seasons. Now movement has no season at all. People rush through days as though time were prey to be hunted. The ancient art of collective stillness, those long fireside silences that once synchronized hearts, has been replaced by the artificial flicker of blue light on faces that never look at one another. Anthropologists studying industrial societies often describe this as temporal dislocation, the feeling that life is always elsewhere. The hunter once waited for the herd, now the worker waits for the weekend, the notification, the next thing. The waiting remains, but the stillness, the mindful kind, has vanished. Instead of patience, there's anticipation. Instead of observation, distraction. The noise never stops, and silence feels like failure. Even the body revolts. Stress hormones spike from perpetual urgency. Sleep collapses under the weight of schedules. Humans evolved to move in bursts and then rest. Now they run endlessly in place, mistaking exhaustion for achievement. It's as if the species traded survival for simulation movement without migration. Talk without listening. Firelight replaced by electricity that burns but never warms. Yet, beneath the hum of modern life, the old instincts twitch. When power cuts out, when the city goes dark, something ancient stirs, a quiet relief, almost embarrassment at how natural stillness still feels. In those rare pauses, the body remembers what civilization forgot. That presence isn't idleness, it's equilibrium. The ancestors didn't rest because they were lazy. They rested because the earth demanded it. The irony is hard to miss. In a world obsessed with connection, people have never been more disconnected from the one practice that made connection possible: shared quiet. Real presence isn't in words or signals, it's in synchronized silence, the kind that once kept entire camps alive through long winters. Modern humans have the technology to speak instantly across continents, yet they can't sit beside one another without reaching for a device. The ancient rhythm of stillness wasn't lost completely, though. It just went underground, into the rituals that pretend to be leisure: yoga classes, meditation apps, sound baths for the overstimulated. All desperate reenactments of what the ancestors did every night without trying. Survival has become therapy. The old wisdom, once instinctive, now costs by the hour. But the lesson still lingers, stubborn and patient as the earth itself. The species that once learned to survive by staying still together may yet remember that strength isn't acceleration, it's cohesion. The future, if there is one, probably belongs to whoever rediscovers how to stop. Because in the end, it was never about dominance or invention. It was about staying still long enough to hear the world breathing with you. And that ancient rhythm that shared, deliberate quiet, might be the one thing capable of saving us again. If history has a sense of humor, it lies in how it keeps circling back to the same truths. After centuries of noise, speed, and self-importance, humanity seems to be rediscovering what its ancestors already knew. Stillness isn't weakness, it's strategy. The same quiet endurance that once kept camps alive through ice and famine is now being repackaged as mindfulness, resilience, and other words that make ancient wisdom sound like a TED Talk. But the core remains the same. To endure, you stop running, you gather, you breathe, you wait. In every field, psychology, anthropology, ecology, the evidence piles up. Cooperation.com and collective regulation outperform panic and isolation. We're biologically wired to find safety in each other. The heartbeat still slows when another heartbeat is near. The nervous system still softens to rhythm. Modern science calls it co-regulation. Early humans called it life. Communities that thrive today often mirror the old survival structures: smaller circles, shared meals, slower hours. They mimic the same principles that once held families together under the threat of cold and hunger. The revival of communal living, slow food, and environmental stewardship isn't nostalgia. It's muscle memory resurfacing. Civilization's new luxury isn't speed, it's stillness without fear. Even the technologies that fractured attention are being repurposed to restore it. Meditation apps hum softly where fires once crackled. Online groups form digital tribes, imperfect, but yearning for the same thing: to be still together in an endless storm of motion. Humans can't undo evolution. They can only improvise around it. The craving for calm isn't a lifestyle trend. It's an ancestral reflex trying to find its way back home. In anthropology, there's a phrase, the social body. It means that survival has never been individual, that every pulse is part of a larger system. The first social body huddled around a fire. The next might exist in neighborhoods that relearn proximity, in families that eat without screens, in cities that rediscover silence as a civic virtue. The future, ironically, may look very old, because quiet strength has always been the rarest kind. It's the force that doesn't announce itself, the one that builds endurance out of patience, the one that knows movement isn't progress if no one's moving together. In that sense, our ancestors were never primitive. They simply listened longer. They knew that the strongest structure wasn't a wall or a weapon, but a circle of breathing bodies holding steady against the dark. And maybe that's how the story ends or begins again. Not with conquest or invention, but with a return to something beautifully uneventful. People sitting close, the air still, the noise outside fading into background, the quiet hum of shared existence, the one rhythm that has never failed us, because survival was never about who could lift the most, shout the loudest, or run the farthest. It was, and always will be, about who can stay.